I would like to welcome everybody. My name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted that everyone is here. Welcome to today's Sunday program. This is one of our programs in our series on stories of hope. And today we have a lovely story about a safe haven at a time when the United States was not open to refugees during World War II. The tiny island of Cuba was open and hospitable and welcoming. And we got to see all about that in this gorgeous film we saw today. And it's just so wonderful that we have both filmmakers with us today, as well as two of the stars of the film. Before I introduce them, I would like to tell you about upcoming programs. Next week, August 2nd, we're featuring the film called Defying the Nazis, The Sharps' War, and that tells the story of the Unitarian minister Waitstill Sharp and his wife Martha Sharp, who together went to Czechoslovakia and later to France in order to rescue children. So they left their own children in the care of others to put themselves voluntarily in harm's way to rescue human lives. And it's this very inspiring, beautiful story that aired on PBS. It was a co-production of Ken Burns and Artemis Jakowski, who's the grandson of Waitstill and Martha Sharp. And we're going to have Artemis Jakowski with us together with one of the children that Martha Sharp saved. So that's next week, and you won't want to miss it. The following week, August 9th, we're featuring an author, Yvette Manessis Corporon, who wrote a book about her own family history. It's called Something Beautiful Happened. And it's her own story of how her Greek Orthodox grandmother during World War II was part of a network who saved a Jewish family on a Greek island. And so Yvette, who is herself a producer with the TV show Extra, she's an investigative reporter, she's an author, she's won 3 Emmy Awards, and she went in search of her own family history. She wanted to find this family that she had heard about all her life from her grandmother. So she scoured the globe looking for this family. She found them, they had a glorious reunion, and then 2 days later, her own family was subject to a horrific anti-Semitic attack in the US when her nephew, not Jewish, was going to use the pool at the Jewish Community Center, and he and his grandfather were brutally murdered by somebody who shouted, "Heil Hitler." And out of that incident came their family foundation, which is seeking to bridge differences, and they're doing so much good in the world. So this story, Something Beautiful Happened, is about World War II, and it's about today. And it's a breathtaking story that, again, you will not want to miss. Let me get to our special guests for today. So first, I want to turn to one of our 2 filmmakers, Judy Kreit. Judy is, she's a dancer and she's a filmmaker, and she's going to introduce her film. So Judy, take it away.
Thank you. Olivia, I really want to thank you for this opportunity to screen our film with you, with the Sousa Mendes Foundation, and have the opportunity to share our stories with you today. I'd also really like to thank the National Center for Jewish Film. They're our film distributors, and send out a huge thank you to all of you who are here to join us. Since I was a teenager, I'd heard stories about my mother working in a diamond industry in Havana, Cuba, after she and her family had the great, amazing luck, fortune to escape Nazi-occupied Europe. When she told me these stories, she would also always say that it was a win-win situation during the war. At the time, I was busy being a teenager, pursuing my love of dance and trying to spend as much time with my friends as possible. Teaching dance later became not only my passion, but my career. And in 1995, I took my first Afro-Cuban dance class here in Boulder, Colorado. I fell in love with this style of dance and decided that I needed to go study more at the source in Cuba. In the year 2000, I asked my parents to come with me to Cuba for our very, very first trip. My mother spent time going back to the home where she lived and seeing things that she had remembered from her teenage years. And I had the fortune and wonder also to travel with them, but also to immerse myself in the beauty of Afro-Cuban music and dance. I later returned many times to Cuba to continue studying, to really continue to pursue my passion. I also grew to have the greatest respect for the love, the care, the acceptance, and the warm hearts of the Cuban people. My Cuban friends maintain and are still some of my dearest friends. Years later, my mother's story became much more pressing. I wanted to hear everything I could possible about her time in Cuba. I would write down everything she told me, and from there I created a memoir of her escape and her years in Havana. In 2013, I decided to begin with a video project so I could have something to share for our family. So we began the video project, and the incredible good fortune is that Robin Truesdale was behind the camera. As we began talking, the two of us decided this story was so incredible and that we really, really wanted to go ahead and take the deep breath and make a film about the little known story of the Jewish refugees who escaped the Holocaust by finding safety in Cuba. Our first major undertaking was to find refugees who were willing to share their story with us, and hopefully some of the children of these refugees who also would be willing to be a part of the film and join us in this incredible journey. So our great fortune, our amazing fortune, took us to New York, where we first had the opportunity to work with Felicia Rosshandler, who is here today, which is just such a fantastic reality. She's here today. And during this trip, we spent time in the archives of the American Joint Distribution Committee. And these archives are integral to our film. Later in our project, the JDC honored us with the very first ever JDC Archives documentary film grant. Another very important aspect of our trip to New York was to have a chance to interview Richard Grossbard, who is the son of Jacques, who's also in the film. One of my favorite memories, makes me laugh every time, is that when Robin and I arrived in New York, we rented a mountain of photography gear, which we needed for our filming, and which of course subsequently we would need to schlep all around New York City. When I first saw the pile of gear, I literally felt like crying, not having a clue how we were going to get it all over. But when we pulled up to Richard Grossbard's apartment, that is facing Central Park, in our taxi full of gear, a handsome and tall doorman appeared, and his name was Izzy. And he said, are you the women that are here to interview Mr. Grossbard? And both Robin and I smiled, and we said, yes, that's us. And he said, well, don't you lift a finger, because don't you ever lift a thing. I am going to help you take all your gear up to Mr. Richard Grossbard's apartment. And needless to say, that was like music to our ears. It was a fantastic welcome to New York. So I know Robin remembers this story, and I think she has some other amazing memories of our filming adventures as well.
Thanks, Judy. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm Robin Truesdale. I'm the co-director with Judy, and it has been just, it's been an absolute pleasure to work with her and her mom, and to meet all of the other people that are introduced in our film. We did have a pretty amazing time in New York City. and we did schlep around a lot of camera equipment. One interesting thing about this film is that it's made by the two of us. It's really Judy and I. We're a two-person team. I did the primary photography and editing, all the editing for the project. And we really brought, I think, a female perspective to this story. Between Judy and I and her mother and Felicia and some of the other people we interviewed, we tell a story that goes into family, and it's a little different than some documentaries might be told, because you know, they're very personal stories. And as you saw in the film, they remember their mothers helping them through all their hardships. And so the women's perspective is a very important one for me, and I think it's something to keep in mind with this film. We intentionally did not go into a lot of discussion about the situation, because we wanted it to be more memory-based. So that's how we approach the film. I do have a great memory, travel memory, not from New York City as much as from Cuba. Judy was amazing in her insight, knowing that I needed to see Cuba as the editor, bringing all of these pieces together. She really wanted me to have a sense of that country. And even though we did not have anyone to interview there, because we could not find any people who still lived in Cuba who had gone through this refugee period. But we did go and we got some beautiful photography, and I have to say the people were amazing. And it showed me what atmosphere these refugees must have greeted when they came to the shores of Cuba in 1941, 1942. One little story is that I arrived in Havana in the evening. It was dark, and Judy had been there a couple of days earlier, and she had been to Cuba many times. And so on our way we got in the taxi, and on our way to where we were staying, she informed me that we were going to be up bright and early the next morning to do some filming on the beach. And so the first time I ever laid eyes on the beauty of Havana was actually as the sun was coming up over the beach. I'm getting my camera gear together, and Judy and her dance teacher are dancing on the beach with the sunrise. It was just spectacular. That's the first scene you see in the movie. Damaris, her dance teacher, dancing and welcoming all of us to this story. Marion is joining us, Judy's mom, who I hope you all fell in love with her in the film. I know I did, as I got to know her more and more. And Marion, I'd like to toss it to you and tell us some of your memories.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being with us. I am Marion Kreit, Judy's mom, and I was born in Germany in 1927, just before the Nazis started the crusade against the Jews. We left for Belgium in 1938, and again in 1941, after 1 year occupation, we escaped to southern France, which was still unoccupied at that time, to wait for our Cuban visa. The Cuban Consulate in Marseille was an old house with rickety steps and throngs of refugees waiting to see if their visa had arrived. And in the office was this woman sitting in front of a huge ledger, flipping pages back and forth. And that ledger contained the names of the people who had gotten their visa. So she was flipping pages back and forth and said to me, "No, you're not there." And I looked over her shoulder, and boy, there was our name, Winkels. It was sheer luck that I had cited that, because that visa at the time was a matter of life and death. And when we arrived in Havana, it was with the assumption that it would be for a very short time, just to wait for our American visa to come. And so I was sent to an American school, and the kids there had no clue as to what was going on in the world. And I felt like a total alien. But shortly after that, it became clear that our stay at Cuba was going to be pretty indefinite because the States had entered the war. And so I was sent to a Cuban school. We had regular classes in the morning and vocational classes in the afternoon, and there were very few girls. And I remember very clearly that we had to wrap our skirts tightly around our legs because going up that open staircase, the boys would congregate down below to get a peep. So that school went on strike and I went to work. There were many factories in Cuba that had popped up, and each factory had 50% Cuban workers and 50% refugees. It was a total win-win situation because there were jobs for the Cubans and the refugees had a way to make a living. It was a true windfall. The interesting thing was the conglomerate of languages that were kicked down. There was French, Flemish, Spanish, of course, a smattering of German, and a lot of Yiddish. But somehow we all managed to understand each other. And by and large, the atmosphere in those factories was quite harmonious. The work was hard, but I was very happy to be able to support my family. My social life consisted mostly of a Zionist youth organization, the Bantif, and every once in a while, Jacques, you heard a lot about Jacques in the film, would take me out to the movies, and that was really special. And here is a tiny little Cuban figurine. If you can't figure out what the head is made of, it is made of the rolling part of the deodorants that we used to use. Cubans are very, very imaginative. And I do want to tell you a little anecdote. We had a seamstress. Her name was Lola. She lived in a shack, in a wooden shack, mind you. Poverty was rampant in Cuba at the time. And she was an exquisite dressmaker. And she was fitting me for a dress. And I said, hey, shorten it for me a bit, will you? And she said, cubriendo por arriba y dejando ver por abajo, which meant covering up at the top and letting see on the bottom, typically Cuban. Life in Cuba was interesting. It was hard. It was also salvation for a great many of us, and I'm infinitely grateful.
Thank you, Marion. That's a great story. I love your memories. You have, the more we spoke with you as we interviewed, the more memories came forth. And I think that's one of the blessings of this project. Now I want to introduce Felicia, who's in New York. And we'd love to hear from you, Felicia. What do you have to share with us?
Well, I want to say one of my earliest memories in the late 30s in Belgium, which is where we were living, was the word visa. That's all my family talked about, getting a visa. The consulates all over Europe had long lines, people trying to get a visa. And into our lives came the Salvadorian consul, who saved a lot of people in Antwerp. I don't know the numbers, but he gave us a visa to El Salvador, which meant that we had a place to go. Until you have a visa on your passport, nobody wants you, and you have no place to go. So that was really life-saving. It was 1941. It was during the occupation. Thanks to the my mother, who was very enterprising, I would say, to confirm what Robin mentioned, the women somehow were very instrumental in getting their families out. I think the men were sort of devastated by the loss of their business and their livelihood, while the women always oriented towards family, you know, went into high gear to get you out. And my mother took a truck that was transporting potatoes overnight to Paris and got us some false papers. And we were able to leave Belgium, go to France, go to the Spanish border, and cross over into Spain. In Spain, we took an ocean liner, the Magallanes, and we didn't care where it was going. The Salvadoran consul said, please don't go to El Salvador because they'll have my head if they know that I gave those visas. So the boat was going to Cuba, and tell you the truth, we had heard nothing about Cuba. We didn't know anything about Cuba. I think in those days, people traveled in Europe to the beaches or to the mountains. They didn't travel the way people do today, and geography was much more limited. Anyway, we arrived. We had a 2-week trip across the ocean. For me, it was a picnic. I was 10 years old, and I loved it. I didn't know the Atlantic was mine. I didn't know all the dangers. I was protected by my family. And so we arrived in Cuba, and the welcome was great, as Marion said. I think the history of the St. Louis ship that was turned back in 1939 really reverberated, and the Cubans were open to letting immigrations in. You had to pay $500 a person, plus the money was divided between the customs official and the army and the president. Each got a cut, and that was fine. And the people who couldn't pay were helped by the U.S. Joint Committee to pay their share. And so we landed in Havana, and Batista was president. He was a democratically elected president at the time. And people say he was a friend of the Jews. I don't know, but he certainly wasn't against the Jews. Cubans, never anti-Semitic. Cubans didn't care what your religion was, always welcomed you. And I, for one, my life was a little different than Marion's, because I was younger, for one thing. I was 10 when we arrived, and I didn't have to work. And I went to a bilingual school, Spanish in the morning, English in the afternoon. And as I think Marion also mentioned, we pick up languages very quickly at that age. And within 6 months, I could speak Spanish and French, as well as the French, Spanish and English, as well as French and German we spoke at home. And I loved Cuba, and I didn't want to be a foreigner. I wanted to be Cuban. And as an adolescent, I dragged my mother all over the city because I had to have my own personal chaperone. It wasn't like one chaperone for everybody. Each girl had to have her chaperone. And so we would go to these dances, and the chaperones would all be sitting in one room. And my mother was barely, I don't know, she was 39, 38 at the time. And she just hated the idea. And so the times were not always easy between my mother and me, because in Cuba, young people blossom early. By 13, 14, you're already a young woman. And my mother said, you don't wear lipstick until you're 18, or you don't wear high heels. And so we battled it out a lot. And I think in a way I was doubly alienated by being in a foreign country, alienated by being a teenager. And my best friends became Cubans. I still am in touch with them, and I'm very attached to Cuba. I always think of myself as a refugee, not a survivor, because fortunately we didn't have to ever go to the camps, although we came close to it. And I was very lucky, really, to have led an interesting life, as they say. You know, in China, they say that's a curse, but in the end, although I always never feel quite at home anywhere, I feel enriched. I have three cultures in me, the European, the Latin, and the American. I have wonderful American children, and I have passed on a little bit to them, not that much. I never wanted to saddle them with that history when they were young, but now they're much more aware and much more interested. So, and American grandchildren, of course, as well, 5 of them. So we made it, and we're very happy to be here.
So many amazing stories. One reality about Cuba that we have found as we have done this research is there were many, many parts of Cuba. When we went to talk to Felicia, she and her partner Edmundo said there were many, many different parts of Cuba. My mother remembered incredible classical music programs that came to Cuba, very, very famous composers. She has amazing stories. So there was also the very, very rich and the very, very poor. So the diamond industry, to me, always grabbed my attention. I always felt that it was a surprise. I loved the look on people's faces when I would say, well, you know, there was a diamond industry in Havana during the war, and you would just see their look on their face. A diamond industry in Havana was kind of incongruous to what people know about Cuba. But there it was, and I really, really had such a desire to find out more. And, you know, the gratitude of Robin and my mom and Felicia telling me these stories has been huge. There's just a few aspects of the diamond industry that I would like to bring out before we open it up to questions, and we would certainly welcome your questions. Some of the incredible aspects were, you know, the arrival of a group of primarily Belgian diamond merchants who brought their worldwide connections and their diamond cutting skills. And they arrived in Cuba, and they were able to work together with the Cuban government to create this very, very successful wartime industry. Another aspect that's always been very near and dear to me too, you know, as those of us who spent time in Cuba, the Cuban people are incredibly versatile. They are so good with their hands. They are amazing with working with medicine with their hands. They're just incredibly resourceful. And just a brief story, my mom's friend Jacques had a very wonderful Cuban mechanic friend by the name of Pico, and Pico helped Jacques create some of the best machinery in Cuba. And the fact that almost all the machinery for the industry was manufactured right there in Cuba has always been an incredibly amazing part of the story, because once again, more people were employed to be able to create the machinery that people used for cutting, polishing, and faceting the stones. Another aspect of the story was something that was called the 50% labor law. So often you'll hear the 50-50 of 50% refugees and 50% Cubans. In fact, this was a law in Cuba that went back to other nationals who wanted to create businesses in Cuba. And that law required that 50% of the laborers, of the workers, were Cubans. And so that, of course, was a part of this story, but that allowed also for the other 50% to be the Jewish refugees from Europe. And those refugees were able, again, to find safety and also have a way to make a living throughout the duration of World War II.
So thank you, Judy. I think we're going to start opening it up to questions. There are already some questions in the chat box. So let me start asking them, and then whoever would like to answer them, please just jump in. So one is from Jane Friedman, whose family is from Belgium, who says, I'm looking for information about my grandmother, Anna Ginsberg, who lived in Cuba during the war with her husband, Henri Cypre. I would love to know if any of the people involved with the film knew about them. Thank you. Anybody?
Oh,
No?
I must say, sometimes photos really help. I don't know if she might have any photos of her relatives, but sometimes that really sparks a memory too. So, but does the name sound
No.
familiar?
name does not sound familiar.
Okay, let's move on. This question, I guess, was already addressed, but I'll ask it anyway. Why was this experience so different from that of the St. Louis passengers?
I'm going to say a few words and then I'll turn it over to Felicia. The St. Louis happened at a very, very different time. My husband helped me with a little research. The St. Louis was also, it left from Hamburg. There was intense anti-Semitic propaganda that followed this ship. There was also a different president who was president at the time, President Laredo Bru, who said, I cannot accept this ship to land. It may be viewed, I've heard it may be viewed as an act of war. But as we know, a change of presidency, a change of government can make all the difference. And when President Batista was elected in 1940, he again, as Felicia said, the St. Louis had an enormous impact, and Cuba did not want to repeat the St. Louis story. But also Batista did allow in a different wave of refugees, again, many of them from Belgium and my mother from Germany. And so after 1940, with the change of government, that once again, with Batista, the gates were reopened for another wave of close to 6,000 refugees to enter.
Felicia, did you want to add something?
Well, I wanted to add that in the United States, the State Department was led at the time by a man called Breckinridge Long, who was strongly anti-Semitic, and he encouraged Roosevelt not to admit any more refugees because the ship did go to the United States and it wasn't admitted here either. And as far as I know, Roosevelt felt that he was very eager to enter the war and the American people were not eager. And he thought if it were pictures as a war to save the Jews, he would never be able to rally the people. So he kept the Jewish issue out of it and, you know, did the Lend-Lease program, helped the British fight in the beginning and then entered the war. But there was strong anti-Semitism in the United States. And that's one of the reasons the ship couldn't dock here either and had to tragically go back.
Felicia, can you show everybody your book, please?
Oh, happy to. This is a book I wrote about growing up in Havana. And I felt the need to tell that story. I wanted it to be more than my own story. I wanted it to be the story of all the people who fortunately did not perish in the camp and who became refugees and, you know, were able to live a good life. But I hope it tells that story and it fills a gap which you are now filling as well.
Can you hold it more centrally so people can see the
Oh,
cover?
sorry. Yeah. Of course, I'll be happy to. Okay.
Thank you. So
Published by
then
St. Martin's Press. Yeah.
the next question is, in what section of Havana did the refugees live?
Well, we lived in a section called the Vedado, which is part of Havana, but not downtown Havana. And it's a section that have modern apartment buildings and a lot of greenery and a wonderful avenue, Los Presidentes. And most of the streets were filled with old colonial houses, but we lived in an apartment. When we arrived, there was a very savvy French lady who immediately approached the refugees and said she could find us places to live, and so she did. So.
Yes, we too lived in Vedado. That was the place also where most of the factories sprang up. there's some funny stories about living in the data, but there's no time for that. Next time.
So the next question is about whether the story is known in Cuba. Judy, you touched on that. The question is, I'm curious to know how the story has lived on in Cuba, if it has. The film is such a wonderful window into how the story has lived on in the memories of these brave women, but how do Cubans remember the immigrant community and the diamond business, if you know? Just curious if it has entered local lore.
Well, I'm actually going to let Robin answer this, because I think both of us were in for kind of a surprise when we went to Cuba and kind of what we found there.
Well, we did find, it was hard to find anything. We found that there were very few people who knew about the diamond industry, even in Havana. We tried really hard to find someone we could talk with and, you know, use as an interview in the film, and just no one was available. I know Judy did a lot of research there in Havana. It's difficult because their internet at the time was not what ours is. So you can't just Google search this history. And I'm under the impression that, you know, as government changed over time, a lot of history was sort of put aside, buried in files in back rooms, and a lot of that is just, it's just not accessible right now. So we found that most people were surprised to hear about the diamond industry. I will say that we showed the film in Havana at the International Film Festival in 2017, and the response was amazing. It was opening up new eyes for the people who lived right there in the city.
Fantastic. Next question is, why did Mrs. Kreith and Mrs. Rosshandler choose the states where they settled? So Marion, you're in Colorado, and Felicia, you're in New York, correct?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
So why Colorado? And
Oh
why
my
New York?
That's a long story. That's a long story. I got married to a wonderful man, internationally known, maven on heat transfer and solar energy. And he was invited to teach at the University of Colorado back in '59. And we've lived here ever since. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2018. But Colorado has been very, very good to us.
Felicia, why New York?
Why not New York? But well, that was our destination, and we had a sponsor. We had to have a sponsor in those days, somebody who guaranteed that you would not become a burden of the state. And they lived in New York, and they found an apartment for us on West End Avenue. I remember coming from the bright Cuban sun. It was March, and there was a blizzard. And we lived on a second floor rear, and we faced a brick wall, and it was devastating to suddenly be in that darkness. And but I think we're plucky people. We've been through a lot, and I finished high school in New York, and I've been here ever since. I think I'm a New Yorker now.
Now there's a question from Dr. Miriam Klein-Kasanoff in Miami. She asks, why do you suppose the Cubans had no attitude of anti-Semitism and were so kind and welcoming to you all, the Jewish refugees? What in their makeup culturally accounted for that?
Well, I'll start, but I might send it off, you know, off for a few other comments. I've talked to a variety of Cubans because I too had this same question. And there's a lovely man, his name is Simon Goldstein, one of the most beautiful people on the planet. He used to be the curator of the Holocaust Museum in Vedado. And, you know, people have different feelings, different ideas, but they had said to me that, you know, Cuba being an island has welcomed different people from all over the world for very, very long time. They've got the Chinese there. They, of course, the Taino were the first, the Indians. But they have, of course, the Spanish and then Haiti, the Haitian refugees who came over during the revolution, and by, you know, French, that you have the French influence from Haiti. So, you know, his feeling was that because it's an island and because so many different cultures arrived there, there just wasn't that sense of us and them. There was a different feeling. I also feel that perhaps Catholicism in Cuba wasn't quite as strong as in Spain, and I think that this and this is a bit my feeling, but it wasn't quite as strong as in Spain, and I feel like that anti-Semitism wasn't inherent in the island. So I think for those reasons that it was so used to bringing people in. And just one more aspect is that, you know, sometimes the Jewish refugees were called Polacos, meaning from Poland. And some people thought that wasn't a good thing. But one thing I love about the Cubans is that they love to give people names, like the song Guantanamera is about a beautiful girl from Guantanamo, a beautiful, you know, and they call it Guantanamero. So they really love to, you know, not in a loving way, I think, give a certain reference to where somebody is from. So I found, you know, often they'd say Polaquito or have a little fun, you know, with that. So again, I didn't really feel it was just a way to recognize where a person might have come from.
Now, did any of the refugees in fact settle in Havana? Did that happen or not? That's a question from Frederick Hayat in Switzerland.
I want.
Go ahead. Well, does it mean that they stay after most of us left? Very, very few of our immigration. There was a previous immigration that, yes, had settled in Havana, but there were very few of our generation who stayed after they were permitted to go to the other countries. America, Mexico, back to Belgium after the war. Very few refugees of our generation stayed in Havana after the war was over.
Felicia?
Well, I wanted to just add a cute anecdote about the Polacos, that they a white roll, a white roll with butter was called un polaco con mantequilla, because that's what the Jewish people ate, and so it's called un polaco. And as Marion mentioned, there were Jewish immigrations at the turn of the century. There were Jews from Turkey who came to Cuba, Polish Jews came to Cuba, Russian Jews came to Cuba, and by the 1920s, they were fully integrated. They appeared to be Cubans because they welcomed us, but they were Jewish, and they intermarried. They looked Cuban and they talked Cuban, but they were Cuban Jews. And so Cuba, Havana was a very important harbor, always, as Marion said, and used to international immigration and trade. Plus, Cuba was the last country to be independent from Spain, of all the colonies. And so it had a European orientation because it was under Spain until around 1898.
So there's a question about the internment camp Tiscornia, where I guess the refugees arrived before moving to other places. And so the person writes, my mother and her family were interned in Tiscornia from May to October in '39. Before being moved to New York, she and her parents sailed from Hamburg. They were from Berlin on the Iberia that sailed 9 days before the St. Louis. And then she asks, were all of the women and their families interned in Tiscornia before they were able to live freely in Havana?
Yes, we were all taken to Tiscornia after we got off the ship. Tiscornia was a bit of a detention camp until our papers came through so we could actually get into Havana. It was a detention camp for both men and women. We were separated, of course, but it was a very, very benign kind of detention, and it didn't take very long.
I agree with that. So benign that I don't even remember being there. I mean, I think we just went right through for a week maybe. But that was, that was already 1941, and maybe things were a little more dire in the late 30s. There was some anti-Semitism in Cuba under the dictator Machado. They were allied with Franco, and there was just a simmering for a while, but it didn't last.
So there's a question about Batista and what his motivation was, whether it was financial in letting in the refugees. Does someone know?
Yes. My answer is yes. Plus, I think the United States gave him the okay. He was really, in the hands of the Americans. And if that said you can't do this, they wouldn't have done it. But it was quite beneficial. And they had their hands out, yes. But they were still generous and they were still welcoming. I mean, one doesn't negate the other,
And I do think that I just want to touch for 1 second because I received, there was a time when people actually in 1942, when people were held at Tiscornia for quite some time because there was the fear that there were possibly German spies that were on the ship. So there were people that were actually held in Tiscornia for close to 8 months sometimes. So I just wanted to touch base on that because that also was a part of the story that happened later. But, Felicia has a beautiful line in her book, and I paraphrase Felicia, but I believe your father said, Batista was a friend to the Jews. Remember that line in your book?
Yes, I remember that line.
And to me, it's always with no matter who a person is, as Batista is the case, if he wouldn't have taken over, and of course later he did become a much darker dictator, but he really had an enormous impact on allowing in the Jews into Cuba.
Far be it for me to defend Batista, but he had what they call a dicta blanda, a soft dictatorship in the 40s. And then when he felt threatened by the rebels in the Sierra, he became a much harsher and more cruel dictator. But in the 40s, nobody feared anybody. Nobody feared the police. I mean, things were pretty easygoing. There was poverty. That's certainly true. But there was also big middle class in Cuba, a great cultural life. The conductor, Erich Kleiber, who was, world famous, he conducted the Havana Symphony, and I used to go to that. Louis Jouvet, the French actor, came to perform in Havana, where they were all fleeing Europe. But so it was a rich, beautiful city that never slept. And I have to say, I miss it. I can never go back because it doesn't exist anymore. Something else has taken its place.
There's a question about the diamonds themselves. Where did they come from? You do touch on that in the film.
They came from the United States. They were meant, actually, all the diamonds, as far as I know, in the United States were used for the war effort. And there were a few remnants that were shipped to Havana that could be used for jewelry, because life went on and people needed engagement rings and wedding rings. And so the diamonds that were polished in Havana, as far as I know, were meant for jewelry, while the really serious industrial diamonds stayed in the US. So it was an agreement with the US government.
Now, did any of the refugees actually leave Havana and go to other parts of Cuba?
I don't think so. I do believe that most of us were congregated in Havana, and we stayed pretty close to home. Felicia mentioned the cultural life and mentioned some of the musicians who had come. And I have a story about Arthur Rubinstein, the pianist who came. He gave a beautiful, beautiful concert in the afternoon and then was kind enough to leave his fee in Cuba by gambling it away that night.
Is Tiscornia, or the site where it was located, a place where one could visit today?
Wow, that's a great question, Robin. I think we need to send that one to you.
Well, you and I both know we have such a great memory of Tiscornia. We looked for it. We wanted to find it. Marion had talked about it, and we couldn't find anyone who knew what we were talking about. No one knew what Tiscornia was. We were with some friends of Judy's and taking a ferry across to the other side. I'm not sure of the geography, Judy, but I had my laptop with me in my bag, and they would not allow me to board the ferry with my laptop. So Judy says, well, we'll take your laptop and we'll go around and we'll meet you on the other side because you need to go, you need to see this, take the boat. So when I got to the other side, they had come around in a taxi cab. And amazingly enough, you know, when this stuff happens, you know you're on the right track. The cab driver knew Tiscornia, and he drove us for quite a while, and we thought he's taking us on a long ride just to make the cab fare. And lo and behold, we pull up and we see exactly what Marion had shown us in her pictures. It was incredible. You know where it is better than I do, Judy.
Yeah. Well, it was all because we were trying to bring a laptop on this boat, and they wouldn't let us. I don't know why we needed a laptop on the boat, but when you're filming, you never know. But so the fact that, you know, we had to end up driving around the whole island to find it, you know, sometimes, as they say in different cultures, you know, something good actually comes out of something that first seems not good. So finding Tiscornia was another amazing, amazing story.
So there's another question from Jane Friedman, which is, she says, my grandmother was living in Varadero, which I think is a beach community a few hours from Havana. Does anybody from the film know Varadero?
Sure.
Yes.
The most beautiful beach in the world, they say. That's what we know about it. And it's still, I think, a big tourist attraction, except right now, maybe not. But it's a beach resort, and it's a azure sea that you can see through, and it's not cold, and the sand is as fine as flour.
Mm-hmm.
So question, for those who emigrated to the US, did you find people thought of you as Cuban? And were you discriminated against with the Cuban Missile Crisis, or ignored because they thought of you as Jewish? And how did you feel and react when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened and the aftermath was so strong?
Well, for a while, I got a job on Channel 13. They created briefly a Spanish, a Latin program called Realidades. It was very brief. And I applied for it because I said I was Cuban. And when I got there, most of the people who worked there were from Puerto Rico, and they did not like me for being Cuban. They felt that Cubans were too pushy and, you know, tried to take over everything. And so that's the only time I passed myself off as being Cuban to get this job. Oh, well, I also worked on Spanish edition of Life magazine, and my years in Cuba certainly helped me get that job.
Marion, do you have anything to add on that question?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
No.
So we have 5 minutes left, and we have our 4 speakers, each of whom would like to say some final thoughts. So I guess we're going to start with Marion, whatever you would like to say to our participants.
Well, life in Cuba and the times were very difficult, and we are once again in very, very difficult times. And all I can say is, may the universe be kind to all of us.
Next, Felicia, what would you like to say?
Well, I have to just say, in contrast to Marion, my life in Cuba was incredibly wonderful. I was accepted by Cubans, and I went to a British school, but most of the students were Cuban, and I felt heartbroken when I had to leave. At the same time, I was curious about being in the US, so I was torn, but I remember those years as very, as a part of me. I am partly Cuban. I was 7 years. That's one. I was there a long time.
Robin, it's your turn.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Olivia. I wanted to thank you very much personally for the series that you've been putting on over the summer, this film series, because as an independent documentary filmmaker, I think that bringing these types of stories to people, sharing them and letting them filter through society is so important. We hear so much from these people that we never would have known. I knew nothing of this story before I met Judy and Marion. So I'm just really grateful for the ability to share this film with other people. So thanks everybody for being here.
Judy?
I too, I want to thank everybody and for these incredible series, but also having the time that I have had to learn my mom's story, for you know, Robin to share it with me, and meeting Felicia, meeting the others in the film. It's been so so rich for me. I have just changed so much as a person, and you know, just learned so much. To be tough, to be strong, that things that are really important sometimes, boy, you just have to persevere. But I would like to say that, you know, the Cubans, so often we heard about acceptance. There was kind of a kindness and an acceptance. And I feel very much, as my mother said, that we're going to be in tough times. And if we can, to everybody we meet, offer that kindness and acceptance, I feel the world is going to be a little gentler and easier to handle in these upcoming times. So thank you so much for this opportunity, Olivia and everyone.
Well, I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank our two filmmakers, Judy Kreit, Robin Truesdale, our two refugees who don't want to be called survivors, Marion Kreit and Felicia Ross Handler. And I wanted to thank all of you for giving us a bit of your Sunday. Today, I wanted to remind you that we are a nonprofit organization. We do rely on donations. So if you do like these programs, we would be grateful for donations of any amount. And there'll be a donate button on the thank you email that you receive later this afternoon. So I'm thanking you in advance for anyone who wishes to make a tax-deductible donation so that we can keep these programs going. And I hope we'll see you at the next program next week. So have a nice rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.